Throughout the Legend of Zelda series, death is rarely permanent, and yet it's never quite escapable either. Heroes rise again, villains return across eons, and the cycle continues. But there's another group caught in this endless loop, spirits who weren't destined for resurrection or reincarnation, but rather for something far more tragic. These are the Poes, the lantern-bearing ghosts who wander Hyrule's darkest corners, twisted by regret and bound to a world that no longer wants them. What makes Poes so fascinating isn't just that they're ghosts, it's that they represent something deeply unsettling about the Zelda universe. They're former people, individuals who once had names, families, dreams, and lives. But death didn't grant them peace. Instead, it warped them into monsters, creatures to be hunted, bottled, sold, and exploited. Their souls become literal objects, currency for the living, trophies for collectors, or ingredients for potions that harm anyone foolish enough to consume them. The tragedy of the Poes isn't a single story. It's a pattern that repeats across games, timelines, and incarnations of Hyrule, from the graveyards of A Link to the Past to the lightless depths of Tears of the Kingdom. These spirits tell us something about what happens when death goes wrong, when the passage to whatever comes next is blocked by emotions so powerful it becomes a curse. Their souls twisted by hatred, regret, unfinished business, or betrayal. And once that transformation occurs, there's rarely a way back. The most iconic feature of a Poe is the lantern they carry. These aren't just atmospheric accessories. The lanterns are vessels, containers for the very essence of what these spirits once were. When you defeat a Poe and claim their spirit, you're not just collecting a gameplay item. You're taking what remains of a person, reducing their entire existence to something that fits in a bottle or gets tallied on a collection screen. That's the core horror of Poes. They've already lost everything, and then they lose even the dignity of their own souls. But here's what makes their story worth exploring. Across the many games in the series, there are glimpses of something more, named Poes with identities and histories, spirits who can be freed rather than just destroyed, rare moments where Link's intervention offers actual peace rather than just another death. These exceptions make the rule all the more tragic, because they show us that redemption is possible. It's just agonizingly rare. So let's explore the full scope of this tragedy. Let's talk about what Poes are, where they come from, how they're treated, and what their existence reveals about death in the world of Hyrule. Because understanding the Poes means understanding one of the darkest recurring themes in a series that often seems bright and hopeful on the surface. The earliest appearance of Poes set the template for everything that would follow. In A Link to the Past, these spirits haunt graveyards and darkened corners of Hyrule, drifting through the air with their signature lanterns glowing in the gloom. They're not particularly difficult enemies, not mini-bosses or dramatic encounters. They're just there, part of the landscape of death, as common as tombstones. This is important because it establishes something fundamental about Poes. They're not special. They're not the lingering spirits of great heroes or notorious villains. They're ordinary dead, people whose names have been forgotten, whose stories are lost, but whose inability to move on has transformed them into monsters. The graveyard Poes of A Link to the Past are anonymous, interchangeable, and that anonymity is itself tragic. When you encounter them, there's no dialogue, no explanation of who they were or why they're still here. They simply attack, driven by whatever emotion or curse binds them to the physical world. And when defeated, they vanish, leaving behind nothing but perhaps a few rupees or hearts. There's no suggestion that you've freed them or given them peace. They're just gone, erased, their suffering ending in nothingness rather than resolution. The game presents this without much ceremony. Poes are just one type of enemy among many, filed alongside the other monsters Link must overcome. But if you stop and think about what they represent, there's something deeply unsettling here. These are souls that couldn't rest, and the world's response is to make them into obstacles, things to be cleared away so the living can progress. There's no acknowledgement of what they've lost or what they might have been. The graveyards themselves add to this atmosphere of forgotten tragedy. Rows of tombstones mark the resting places of people who presumably did find peace, who were buried properly and mourned appropriately. But the Poes suggest that not everyone gets that ending. Some are left to wander, their graves perhaps unmarked, or their bodies never properly laid to rest. The proximity of peaceful graves and restless spirits creates a stark contrast. Death in Hyrule has two paths, and the Poes took the wrong one. A Link to the Past doesn't dwell on any of this. The game has bigger concerns: a world to save, a wizard to defeat, maidens to rescue, but it plants the seed for everything that comes after. It establishes that in this universe, death can go wrong, that some souls become trapped, and that these trapped souls are treated as threats rather than victims. This is the foundation, the first glimpse of a tragedy that will deepen and expand across the series. What's particularly striking is how little effort the game makes to explain why these specific dead became Poes, while others presumably passed on peacefully. Were they evil in life? Did they die violently? Are they cursed? The silence on these questions makes the Poes feel arbitrary, as if becoming a wandering ghost is just bad luck, a terrible fate that could theoretically happen to anyone. That randomness makes it worse somehow, more unfair, more tragic. So when Link defeats these early Poes, he's not confronting ancient evils or corrupted villains. He's fighting people who lost everything and then lost even the ability to rest. And the world doesn't mourn them. It just needs them gone, so a hero can pass through on his way to save the day. Ocarina of Time expanded the concept of Poes considerably, giving them more presence, more variety, and most significantly, more exploitation. Here, Poes aren't just graveyard ambience, they're commodities. Their very souls, something to be hunted, collected, and sold. The standard Poes appear in Hyrule Field at night and in the graveyard near Kakariko Village. They're more aggressive than their A Link to the Past counterparts, more defined in their behavior. They fade in and out of visibility, spin with their lanterns extended, and actively hunt Link rather than just drifting aimlessly. These aren't passive spirits. They're angry, active threats, suggesting that whatever binds them to the world has given them purpose, even if that purpose is just mindless aggression. When Link defeats a Poe, something remarkable happens. The spirit emerges from the defeated body, and Link can capture it in a bottle. This is where the tragedy becomes transactional. The Poe's essence, everything that remains of who they once were, becomes an item. Something Link can carry in his inventory alongside fish, bugs, and potions. The game even lets you drink Poe spirits, though doing so hurts Link rather than helping him. The corruption within the souls causing damage rather than healing. This detail is easy to overlook, but profoundly dark. Poe spirits aren't just trapped between life and death. They're poisonous, contaminated by whatever emotions or circumstances created them. They're so twisted that their essence causes harm to anyone who consumes it. Even in death, even reduced to their most basic spiritual form, they carry pain and corruption within them. They can't help Link. They can only hurt him. But the darkest element comes from the Poe Collector, a character who perfectly embodies the exploitation of death. This mysterious figure, dressed in the same garb as the Poes themselves, runs what amounts to a business based on collecting lost souls. He's not trying to help these spirits find peace. He's not attempting to understand or resolve whatever kept them from moving on. He's just accumulating them, buying them from Link in exchange for rupees and eventually a bottle. The Poe Collector explicitly profits from Hyrule's downfall. He mentions that Poes have become more common as the land has fallen into darkness under Ganondorf's rule, and he sees this as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. More dead, more restless spirits, more inventory for his collection. The fact that he wears Poe-like clothing suggests he might have some connection to the spirits themselves. But rather than using that connection to help them, he's turned it into a business model. Think about what this means. These are people who couldn't rest, whose deaths were so troubled that they became cursed spirits, and the world's response isn't to try to help them, to perform funeral rites or investigate why they're trapped. Instead, there's a market for their souls. They've been turned into a resource, something to be harvested and traded. The Poe collector even rates them, discussing which ones are higher quality, treating souls the way a merchant might evaluate gems or rare artifacts. But Ocarina of Time also gives us something else, named Poes, with actual identities and stories. The big Poes are rarer, more powerful spirits that roam Hyrule Field, and defeating them yields souls that the Poe collector particularly prizes. They're stronger, more defined, suggesting they were more significant in life, or that their unrest is more powerful. But even these enhanced spirits are just commodities to the collector, merely worth more rupees than the standard variety. Then there are the Composer brothers, Sharp and Flat. These two spirits have names, history, and most importantly, a resolution. They were once royal composers for the Hyrulean family, creating music for the court, but now they haunt the graveyard, trapped as Poes, their musical legacy reduced to ghostly lantern-bearing menace. Their existence as Poes is presented as a curse or punishment, something wrong that needs correcting. When Link learns the Sun's song from them, he helps free their spirits. This is different from simply defeating a Poe and collecting its soul. This is actually resolving whatever kept them bound to the world, allowing them to move on properly. Sharp and Flat thank Link and fade away, not destroyed, but finally at rest. It's one of the few moments in the entire series where a Poe gets a genuinely positive ending, where their suffering actually ends in peace, rather than just ceasing to exist. The Poe Sisters are another example of named Poes with identities, 4 ghosts who haunt the forest temple, each one representing a different aspect of their collective curse. Amy, Beth, Joelle, and Meg aren't just random spirits. They're siblings, bound together even in death, their unrest shared among them. Defeating all 4 and collecting their flames is necessary to progress through the temple, but it's also presented as putting them to rest, freeing them from whatever curse held them there. These named Poes matter because they show us the exception to the rule. When spirits have identities, when we know who they were, the game treats their resolution differently. They're not just monsters to clear from a dungeon, they're souls to be freed. But this mercy is only extended to a handful of Poes across the entire series. The vast majority remain anonymous, their identities lost, their souls collected and commodified without any acknowledgement of what they've lost. Ocarina of Time thus presents the full spectrum of the Poe tragedy. Anonymous spirits treated as enemies and resources, named spirits who receive actual resolution, and underneath it all, the suggestion that death in Hyrule can go terribly wrong, that the line between person and monster is thinner than we'd like to believe, and that once someone crosses that line, the world is far more interested in exploiting them than helping them. Majora's Mask takes place in Termina, a parallel world to Hyrule, but it imports the concept of Poes and amplifies their tragedy to match the game's overall themes of death, regret, and time running out. Nowhere is this more apparent than in Ikana Canyon, a land defined entirely by its failure to die properly. Ikana is a kingdom that fell long ago, but its dead never moved on. The entire region is populated by Redeads, Gibdos, and Poes, all spirits or cursed beings trapped in a state between life and death. The kingdom itself is cursed, unable to fully pass into history, frozen in a state of decay and unrest. This is the perfect environment for Poes, and indeed they appear throughout the canyon, more numerous here than anywhere else in the game. The Composer brothers return in Majora's Mask, but their story is darker, more complex, and more tragic than their Ocarina of Time counterpart. Here, Sharp and Flat aren't just cursed, they're caught in a narrative of betrayal, dark pacts, and sibling tragedy, that makes their Poe status feel earned rather than arbitrary. According to the story revealed in Ocarina, Sharp made a pact with a dark force, something that cursed the entire kingdom and trapped his brother Flat's spirit in the process. The details are vague, deliberately so, but the implication is clear. Sharp's choices led to Flat's suffering, and now both brothers are trapped as Poes, their relationship poisoned by guilt, betrayal, and regret. Flat is imprisoned beneath the graveyard, unable to rest, unable to move on, trapped by both the curse and by his connection to Sharp. Sharp, meanwhile, haunts the music box house, his guilt and the curse intertwining to keep him bound to the world. They're separated even in death, unable to resolve their relationship, unable to find peace because the wound between them remains open. Link's intervention comes through the Song of Storms, a melody that has always had connections to the supernatural and the power to affect the dead. Playing it allows both brothers to finally be freed, their spirits ascending together, their reconciliation achieved only in the moments before they finally pass on. It's one of the most emotionally resonant Poe resolutions in the series, because we understand what kept them trapped. We see the relationship, the betrayal, the guilt, and then the release. But this mercy is again exceptional. The other Poes in Ocarina don't get names or stories or resolutions. They're just part of the landscape of decay, spirits who were caught up in whatever curse destroyed the kingdom and who remain trapped centuries or even millennia later. They attack Link not because of personal grudge, but because that's what restless spirits do in this cursed land. They're defending nothing, achieving nothing, just existing in eternal unrest. The Poe Collector returns in Majora's Mask, now running a different kind of operation. Instead of simply buying souls, he oversees a ghost battle trial in the Spirit House, a bizarre attraction where Link fights waves of enemies for prizes. The Collector's dialogue suggests he's made peace with the fact that not all souls can be saved, that some spirits are too far gone, too corrupted or cursed to ever find rest. His role has shifted from profiteer to something more ambiguous, perhaps even slightly resigned. This evolution is interesting because it suggests that even someone who deals with Poes regularly, who understands them better than most, recognizes that many of them are beyond help. The Poe Collector in Majora's Mask seems wearier, less enthusiastic about his work, as if dealing with the dead for so long has worn him down. He still runs his operation, still engages with spirits as commodities in some sense, but there's an undercurrent of melancholy to it now. Ocarina Canyon as a whole presents Poes not as isolated tragedies, but as part of a larger curse, a kingdom-wide failure of death to function properly. The suggestion is that curses can trap entire populations, that whatever happened to Ocarina was so catastrophic that it prevented all the dead from moving on. The Poes here are victims of something larger than themselves, caught up in magical fallout they may not have even understood when it happened. This makes their fate even more tragic. The anonymous Poes of Ocarina didn't necessarily do anything to deserve their curse. They were just people living in a kingdom that was destroyed by forces beyond their control. And when they died, whatever curse hung over the land trapped them as wandering spirits. They've been Poes for centuries, possibly longer, with no hope of resolution until Link arrives to slowly lift the various curses plaguing the region. Even then, it's not clear that defeating the Poes actually frees them. Unlike Sharp and Flat, who visibly ascend and find peace, the regular Poes simply cease to exist when defeated. Do they find rest, or are they just destroyed? The game doesn't say, leaving their ultimate fate ambiguous and potentially even darker than their continued wandering. Majora's Mask thus deepens the Poe tragedy by connecting it to larger themes of curses, regret, and the failure of death itself. In Termina, the Poes aren't just individual spirits who couldn't move on. They're symptoms of a world where death has broken down, where the passage from life to whatever comes after has been severed or corrupted. They're evidence that when things go wrong on a cosmic scale, The individual dead pay the price. The Wind Waker and Four Swords adventures introduce a new horror to the Poe narrative. The concept of fused spirits, multiple souls forced together into a single entity. This isn't just death gone wrong. This is identity itself being violated, individual souls losing their distinctness and being merged into something larger and more monstrous. Jalhalla, the boss of the Earth Temple in Wind Waker, represents this concept at its most dramatic. This massive Poe is composed of numerous smaller spirits, all fused together into one giant entity. The boss fight reflects this, as Link must shatter Jalhalla into its component spirits, and then individually defeat each one before they can recombine. It's a perfect mechanical representation of the horror at play here. These spirits aren't just trapped, they're trapped together, their individual identities subsumed into a collective entity. Think about what this means for the souls involved. They're not just unable to rest, they can't even maintain their own sense of self. They're part of something larger, forced to act in concert, their individual wills and desires irrelevant. Whatever kept them from moving on has been compounded by being merged with other trapped souls, creating an entity that's more curse than ghost, more mass than individual. The lore suggests Jalhalla was created or empowered by Ganondorf's magic, used as a guardian to prevent Link from restoring the Master Sword's power. This means these fused spirits aren't just suffering, they're being used, their collective form weaponized against the hero. Even in death, even trapped and twisted, they're being exploited, turned into a tool for evil. When Link defeats Jalhalla, the spirits are presumably freed, but the game doesn't confirm this. We don't see them ascend or find peace. They simply vanish after being defeated, leaving behind a heart container and allowing Link to progress. The ambiguity is intentional and unsettling. After being fused and used as a weapon, do these spirits finally get to rest? Or are they just destroyed? Their suffering ended not by resolution, but by obliteration. Four Swords Adventures features a similar concept with its own Big Poe boss, again depicting a large spirit formed from smaller ghosts merged together. The pattern repeats, different game, different timeline, but the same horror of lost identity and fused souls. It suggests that this is a recurring possibility in the Zelda universe, that under certain conditions, multiple Poes can be forced into a single entity, their individual tragedies compounded into something even worse. The fusion of Poes raises questions about what exactly Poes are made of and how they can be manipulated. If souls can be forced together, does that mean there's a physical or magical substance to them? Something that can be combined, like ingredients in a potion? The treatment of Poe spirits as bottled items in other games supports this, suggesting that souls have a material quality that can be contained, combined, or consumed. But this materiality makes their fate even more tragic. They're not ethereal presences beyond physical harm. They're substantial enough to be manipulated, captured, fused, and used. Their ghostly nature doesn't protect them from being treated as objects or resources. In fact, it might make them more vulnerable, easier to exploit specifically because they lack the physical form that might let them resist. The visual design of Jalhalla emphasizes this tragedy. The massive Poe isn't majestic or powerful looking in a traditional sense. It's grotesque, a bloated mass of merged spirits, its oversized form suggesting something unhealthy, something that shouldn't exist. When light hits it, it becomes corporeal and vulnerable, suggesting that exposure and visibility are threats to this unnatural fusion. The smaller Poes that emerge when it shatters are barely distinct from each other, further emphasizing the loss of identity. What's particularly disturbing is that none of the individual spirits within Jalhalla are named or identified. We have no idea who they were in life, how they became Poes, or why they were fused together. They're completely anonymous, their individual stories erased first by becoming Poes, and then again by being merged into a collective entity. They've lost everything twice over, identity stripped away in layers, until nothing individual remains. The Earth Temple setting adds another layer to this tragedy. This is a sacred place, a temple dedicated to one of the sages, a location that should represent order and spiritual power. Yet it's been corrupted, turned into a prison for the sage Medley and a haunting ground for this fused mass of spirits. The temple itself has been perverted from its purpose, just as the spirits have been twisted from their original identities. When Link restores the temple by defeating Jalhalla and awakening Medley as a sage, the spiritual balance is supposedly restored. But the Poes themselves don't receive any acknowledgement in this restoration. They were just an obstacle, a boss to overcome, and their suffering is incidental to the larger narrative of saving the world and empowering the sages. Even in a game about restoring balance and hope to a flooded world, the Poes remain an afterthought, their tragedy invisible to everyone, except perhaps the player who stops to think about what they represent. The fused Poe concept shows us that the exploitation and suffering of these spirits can always get worse, that there are depths to the tragedy we hadn't even considered in earlier games. It's not enough that they're trapped and hunted and commodified. They can also be forced to lose their very identities, merged into masses that erase even the possibility of individual resolution. Twilight Princess presents perhaps the most extensive and systematic collection of Poe souls in the series, and it does so through the cursed man Jovani, a character whose personal tragedy mirrors and amplifies the suffering of the Poes themselves. When Link transforms into a wolf through the Twilight's power, he gains the ability to see things invisible to normal sight, and among these hidden elements are the imp Poes, spirits that regular people can't perceive. These Poes are scattered throughout Hyrule, 60 in total, haunting locations across the entire land. They're not concentrated in graveyards or cursed regions. They're everywhere, suggesting that restless dead are far more common than anyone realizes. The imp Poes are distinct from regular Poes in appearance but not in essence. They still carry lanterns, still represent trapped souls, still attack Link when encountered. What makes them notable is their connection to Jovani's curse, a supernatural bargain that went horribly wrong. Jovani was once a normal man living in Castletown, but greed consumed him. He sold his soul to Poes in exchange for wealth, a deal that seemed advantageous until its true price became clear. The Poes granted him riches, but the cost was that Jovani himself was transformed into a golden statue, frozen in place, unable to move or truly live despite being technically alive. His soul had been fragmented and dispersed among the Poes, leaving him trapped in a gilded prison of his own making. This is already tragic, a cautionary tale about greed and deals with dark forces. But what makes it relevant to our discussion of Poes is what happens next. Link can collect Poe souls by defeating the imp Poes scattered across Hyrule, and delivering these souls to Jovani gradually breaks his curse. First, collecting 20 souls restores Jovani's ability to move, though he remains golden. Then collecting all 60 souls fully breaks the curse, returning him to normal human form and freeing his cat, who was also frozen by the curse. Here's what's dark about this. The Poe souls Link collects aren't just random spirits. They're fragments of Jovani's own soul, dispersed among the Poes as part of the deal. Or perhaps they're the souls of the Poes themselves, now bound to Jovani's curse, their freedom tied to his. The game isn't entirely clear on this distinction, but either interpretation is troubling. If they're fragments of Jovani's soul, then defeating these Poes means reclaiming pieces of a person who was foolish enough to sell himself to dark forces. But the Poes still had to exist in the first place for the deal to be made, which means they were already trapped, already suffering, and then they were used as currency in a supernatural transaction. They became the mechanism of someone else's curse. If they're the souls of the Poes themselves, then they've been bound to Jovani, their fates intertwined with his, unable to rest until his curse is lifted. They're not just trapped as Poes, they're also trapped in service to this curse, extensions of a punishment that wasn't even originally theirs. they've become collateral damage in someone else's story of greed and consequence. Either way, Link's collection of these souls is framed as a heroic act, a quest to help Jovani and break his curse. But what happens to the Poes themselves? The game never clarifies. When Link delivers the souls to Jovani, they vanish into him, absorbed into whatever magical mechanism is unwinding his curse. Do they find peace afterwards? Are they freed? Or are they simply consumed, used up as fuel for breaking the curse that bound them? The ambiguity is frustrating and telling. Even in a game where Link is explicitly helping someone cursed by Poes, the Poes themselves receive no consideration as potential victims. They're just obstacles and quest items, their ultimate fate deemed unimportant compared to Jovani's redemption. And Jovani is redeemed, at least partially. He survives his mistake, returns to normal life, even becomes wealthy legitimately through the family business. The Poes, meanwhile, cease to exist one way or another. What makes this especially tragic is how systematic it is. 60 Poes, spread across the entire land, each one requiring Link to track it down, defeat it, and claim its soul. It's framed as a completionist challenge, something for dedicated players to accomplish for the satisfaction of a 100% completion rating. The game rewards you for collecting all 60 souls, giving you increasingly valuable prizes, and ultimately a special collectible. The Poes have been gamified, their suffering turned into content. The imp Poes themselves are more aggressive than standard Poes, more twisted in appearance, as if their binding to Jovani's curse has warped them further. They flicker in and out of visibility even to Wolf Link's enhanced senses, suggesting they're barely holding on to existence. When defeated, they shriek and explode into mist, their dissolution dramatic and final. There's no sense that they've been freed, only that they've been destroyed. Castletown, where Jovani lives, is bustling and prosperous, full of normal people going about their lives, completely unaware that their neighbor made a deal with restless spirits that scattered pieces of cursed souls across the entire kingdom. The contrast between the mundane world of the living and the hidden world of the Poes is stark. Most people don't even know Poes exist, let alone that they're everywhere, suffering and trapped. This hidden quality makes the Poes even more tragic. They're invisible to most of the world, their suffering happening in a layer of reality that normal people can't perceive. Only Link, transformed into a beast by Twilight magic, can see and interact with them. To everyone else, they might as well not exist. Their tragedy is literally invisible. Jovani's curse also demonstrates that Poes aren't just passive victims of circumstance. They're active forces that can curse, bargain, and exact prices. This suggests they have agency, intelligence, and power despite their trapped state. But this power seems to be exclusively destructive or transactional. They can curse the greedy, bind souls, and make dark bargains, but they apparently can't free themselves. Their power only extends to spreading their misery to others. The cat, Gengul, is also frozen by the curse and freed when Jovani is restored. Even an innocent animal became collateral damage in this supernatural disaster. It's a small detail, but it emphasizes how curses in the Zelda universe spread and affect everything connected to the cursed individual. The Poe's influence reaches beyond Jovani to touch even his pet, an uninvolved creature who suffered simply by proximity. Twilight Princess thus presents the most extensive collection quest focused on Poe souls, and in doing so, it highlights how thoroughly these spirits have been reduced to objects and challenges. They're not characters to be saved, but obstacles to be cleared and items to be collected. The game's quest log tracks them like any other collectible, rupees or heart pieces, reducing centuries of suffering to a completion percentage. Tears of the Kingdom represents a fascinating evolution in how Poes are portrayed, finally offering a systematic mercy and a clearer understanding of what Poes are and why they persist. The game moves Poes from the surface world to the depths, that vast underground realm of darkness, and in doing so, it creates a more mythologically complete picture of of these tragic spirits. In the depths, Poes appear as small glowing spirits that don't attack Link. Instead, they're simply present, hovering in the darkness, waiting. These are distinctly different from the hostile Poes of previous games. They're not monsters or enemies, they're lost souls, and the game finally treats them as such. The bargainer statues scattered throughout the depths explain what these Poes actually are. They're souls from ancient times, people who died but never reached the afterlife. Whatever the proper mechanism of death is supposed to be in the Zelda universe, these spirits missed it, fell through the cracks, and ended up trapped in the liminal space of the depths. They're not twisted by rage or corruption, at least not visibly. They're just lost, unable to find their way forward. Link's role here is fundamentally different from his interaction with Poes in previous games. Instead of defeating them and claiming their souls as trophies or quest items, he simply collects them, gathers them up, and delivers them to the bargainer statues. These ancient constructs serve as psychopomps, guides for the dead, and they accept the Poes from Link, presumably helping them continue their journey to wherever souls are meant to go. This is the closest thing to systematic mercy the Poes have ever received. Rather than being bottled, sold, fused into monsters, or used to break curses, these Poes are being guided toward their proper destination. Link becomes an agent of mercy, a ferryman helping lost souls find their way home. It's a redemptive role, and it recontextualizes his relationship with Poes across the entire series. The depths themselves are significant here. This is a realm of total darkness, illuminated only by light roots that Link activates as he explores. It's a space between, a layer of reality that exists beneath the living world, but isn't quite death either. The Poes here are trapped in this in-between state, close to the world of the living but unable to return, close to whatever comes after death but unable to reach it. The architecture of the depths includes ruins and structures that suggest ancient civilizations, places where people once lived and died. The Poes here could be the remains of those ancient peoples, spirits who've been trapped since the fall of their civilizations, unable to move on because the proper death rituals weren't performed, or because the catastrophes that destroyed their societies also disrupted the passage to the afterlife. What's particularly interesting is that these Poes are currency for the bargainer statues. Link trades them for rare items, armor sets, and special rewards. On one hand, this continues the pattern of Poe souls being commodified, used as a form of payment. On the other hand, the bargainers are explicitly helping these souls, so perhaps the transaction is more complex. Maybe collecting and delivering Poes to the bargainers is a service worth rewarding, and the rewards are payment for Link's role as psychopomp. The bargainers themselves are mysterious entities, clearly ancient and connected to death and the afterlife in ways the game doesn't fully explain. They have statues on the surface as well, in locations like the Forgotten Temple, suggesting they're part of a very old tradition of death and soul guidance that predates the Kingdom of Hyrule as Link knows it. Their presence in the depths makes that realm feel like an intentional space, a purgatory or way station designed for exactly this purpose. This reframes the entire concept of Poes. Rather than being aberrations or monsters created by curses, they might be the natural result of death without proper guidance. When someone dies and the psychopomps aren't there to guide them, or when something disrupts the passage to the afterlife, the soul becomes a Poe, trapped in a liminal state. The hostile Poes from previous games might be spirits who've been trapped so long they've been twisted by negative emotions, while the passive Poes in the depths are more recently dead or less corrupted by their imprisonment. The game also introduces the concept of large Poes, spirits worth multiple standard Poes when collected. These might represent more significant individuals or souls who carried more weight in life, though the game doesn't elaborate. What matters is that even these more valuable souls are still treated with the same mercy, collected and delivered to the bargainers, rather than exploited in more sinister ways. Tears of the Kingdom thus offers hope and resolution where previous games offered only tragedy. For the first time, We see a system explicitly designed to help Poes rather than exploit them. The bargainer statues exist specifically to guide lost souls, and Link's quest in the depths isn't about destroying these spirits, but about helping them reach their destination. That said, the game also makes clear just how many souls have been lost over time. The depths are vast, and Poes are scattered throughout them in significant numbers. This suggests that the failure of souls to reach the afterlife isn't rare or exceptional. It's common enough that an entire system had to be developed to deal with it, and even that system couldn't keep up, leaving countless spirits trapped until Link arrives to help. The depths are described as a realm cast in shadow, separated from the light of the surface world. This parallels the realm of shadow from Elden Ring's DLC in interesting ways, both depicting underworlds or hidden realms where the unwanted or forgotten are cast away. But in Tears of the Kingdom, this shadow realm serves a purpose, acting as a collection point for lost souls, a place where they wait for someone to guide them onward. Link's exploration of the depths thus becomes an act of spiritual service as much as adventure. Every Poe he collects is a soul he's helping, a person trapped for potentially centuries who finally gets to continue their journey. It reframes the player's relationship with these collectibles, turning what could be mere completionist hunting into something more meaningful. The question remains, though, what happens to the Poes after Link delivers them to the bargainer statues? Do they finally reach whatever afterlife awaits in the Zelda universe? Are they reborn? Do they simply cease to exist, finally granted the oblivion they couldn't achieve on their own? The game doesn't answer this, maintaining the mystery of what death actually means in this world, but compared to being bottled and sold, fused into monsters, or bound to curses, being delivered to ancient guides who exist specifically to help souls move on, is clearly the best fate Poes have been offered in the entire series. Tears of the Kingdom finally treats them with the dignity and consideration they've been denied for decades of games. While the major entries in the series offer the most detailed explorations of Poes, these spirits appear across numerous other Zelda games, maintaining their core identity as lantern-bearing ghosts of the restless dead. These appearances reinforce the consistency of Poes as a concept, showing that across different worlds, timelines, and incarnations of Hyrule, certain rules about death remain constant. In Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages, Poes appear in the typical locations, graveyards and darkened areas, maintaining their role as spirits that haunt the boundaries between life and death. They're not given significant narrative weight in these games, functioning primarily as enemies and obstacles, but their presence confirms that the tragedy of trapped souls isn't unique to Hyrule. Even in the distant lands of Holodrum and Labrynna, some dead cannot rest. A link between worlds, which exists in a timeline branch separate from many other games, still includes Poes with essentially the same characteristics. They carry lanterns, they appear as ghosts, and they represent souls trapped between worlds. The game's mechanic of merging between Hyrule and Laurel, two parallel dimensions, creates interesting possibilities for Poes. Are they trapped between dimensions as well as between life and death? The game doesn't explore this explicitly, but the visual of Poes appearing in both worlds suggests their curse transcends dimensional boundaries. Phantom Hourglass introduces Poes in a seafaring context, with spirits appearing on certain islands and in the Temple of the Ocean King. Even in a game focused on sailing and maritime adventure, the Poes remain tied to their core concept, ghosts with lanterns who cannot rest. Their appearance in the Temple of the Ocean King is particularly notable, as that location is explicitly connected to time and death, making it a thematically appropriate haunting ground. Across all these appearances, the lantern remains the defining characteristic. It's not just a visual element, but a symbol of the Poe's nature. In many folkloric traditions, lanterns and lights are associated with guiding spirits, psychopomps, or souls unable to find their way. The Poe's lanterns could represent their search for a path forward, a light they carry while wandering in darkness, looking for a way out of their trapped state. The consistency of Poes across such different games and timelines suggests they're a fundamental aspect of the Zelda universe's cosmology. They're not unique to one timeline or one version of Hyrule. They're a universal constant, a representation of what happens when death fails. This elevates them from mere enemy type to mythological significance, a recurring element that tells us something essential about how death works in this fictional universe. The minor variations between games are mostly superficial, different attack patterns, slightly different appearances, but the core concept never changes. A Poe is always a ghost, always carries a lantern, always represents a soul that couldn't move on. This consistency allows the more detailed explorations in games like Majora's Mask or Tears of the Kingdom to inform our understanding of Poes in every other appearance. We can look at a simple Poe in Oracle of Seasons and understand that it represents the same tragedy as the Composer Brothers or the souls in the depths. It's also worth noting that Poes never appear in the more upbeat, light-hearted Zelda games. You won't find them in Triforce Heroes or Link's Awakening's remake in the same way. Their presence is reserved for games that engage with darker themes, that have room for graveyards, curses, and the restless dead. This selective inclusion reinforces that Poes aren't just generic ghost enemies, but thematic elements that require a certain tonal context. The fact that Poes appear in so many games, but are almost never given happy endings, creates a pattern that spans decades of game development. From A Link to the Past in the early 90s through Tears of the Kingdom in 2023, Poes have been consistently portrayed as tragic, exploited, or at best temporarily pacified. The pattern is so consistent it can't be accidental. It's a deliberate choice to use these spirits as representations of death's failures and the costs of curses and unfinished business. This also means that players have been encountering, defeating, and collecting Poe souls for over 3 decades, mostly without being encouraged to think about the implications. The games present them as obstacles and collectibles, and only occasionally do they pause to acknowledge what Poes actually represent. This creates an interesting disconnect between the gameplay experience and the lore implications, a tension between these are just enemies and these are people who suffered and died and then suffered again. The ubiquity of Poes across the series also raises questions about how common this fate is. If every version of Hyrule across multiple timelines has Poes, does that mean becoming a trapped spirit is a relatively common outcome of death? How many people in the Zelda universe die properly versus how many become Poes? The games never provide statistics, but the sheer number of Poes Link encounters suggests it's not a rare occurrence. Stepping back from individual games and appearances, we can identify several consistent themes that define the Poe tragedy across the Legend of Zelda series. These patterns reveal what these spirits represent and why they matter in the larger mythology of the franchise. First and most fundamental is that Poes are born from regret, hatred, unfinished business, or betrayal. They're not random. Something prevents them from moving on, some emotional or spiritual weight that anchors them to the world of the living. The Composer Brothers were cursed. The Poe Sisters were bound to the forest temple. Jovani's Poes were created through a dark bargain. The souls in the depths simply never found their way to the afterlife. This suggests that death in the Zelda universe requires more than just the cessation of life. It requires resolution, completion, the settling of emotional and spiritual accounts. When someone dies with too much left undone, when they're consumed by negative emotions, when curses interfere with the natural process, they become Poes. Death has requirements, and failing to meet them has consequences. The second major theme is the objectification of souls. Poes don't just suffer by being trapped, they suffer by being treated as resources rather than people. Their spirits can be bottled like potions, sold like commodities, collected like rupees, and used as currency. This commodification strips away the last vestiges of their humanity or personhood, reducing them to mere objects with exchange value. This is particularly dark because it means that even in their suffering, Poes continue to be exploited. Death hasn't freed them, and neither has becoming spirits. Instead, they've entered a state where they're more vulnerable to exploitation than ever, unable to resist or escape when someone like the Poe Collector or Link comes to harvest their souls. The third theme is exploitation by the living. The Poe Collector profits from their suffering. Jovani used them in a bargain for wealth. Link collects them for rewards and quest completion. Even the bargainer statues, despite their seemingly benevolent purpose, trade items for Poe souls. At every turn, the living find ways to benefit from the Poes' tragedy, treating them as means to ends rather than as beings deserving of consideration. This creates a cynical picture of how the world treats death. The dead have no advocates, no rights, no protection. Once someone becomes a Poe, they're fair game for anyone who wants to use them. The games rarely present this exploitation as wrong or immoral. It's just how things are, an accepted part of the world. The fourth theme is the rarity of mercy. Only a handful of Poes across the entire series receive actual, confirmed, peaceful resolutions. The Composer brothers in both games, the Poe Sisters, the souls delivered to the bargainer statues. Everyone else either ceases to exist when defeated or faces ambiguous fates that are likely just destruction by another name. This rarity makes the exceptional cases more meaningful, but also more tragic. It shows that mercy is possible, that Poes can be freed and find peace, but that this almost never happens. The vast majority of Poes will never receive the intervention that Sharp, Flat, and the others did. They'll simply be defeated, collected, and forgotten, their suffering ending in oblivion rather than resolution. The fifth theme is the connection to curses and betrayal. Many Poes are explicitly tied to curses, either as victims of them or as agents of them. Sharp's Dark Pact cursed Akana. Jovani's bargain cursed him and bound Poes to his fate. The shattering of the Elden Ring affected the Poes in the realm of shadow. Curses create Poes, and Poes perpetuate curses, a cycle that ensures suffering continues and multiplies. Betrayal also features prominently. Sharp betrayed Flat. Marika betrayed her people. The world itself betrays the dead by forgetting them and exploiting their souls. This suggests that Poes are often created by social and relational failures as much as by individual emotional states. It's not just that someone couldn't let go, it's that someone else failed them, abandoned them, or betrayed them in ways that made letting go impossible. The sixth theme is invisibility. Most people in the Zelda universe never see Poes, never think about them, never acknowledge their existence. In Twilight Princess, this is literal. Only Wolf Link can see the imp Poes. But it's also metaphorical across the series. The living go about their lives ignoring the suffering of the dead, building cities and kingdoms on ground where countless spirits wander in torment. This invisibility extends to the player experience. It's easy to play through these games, treating Poes as just another enemy type, never stopping to consider the implications of what they represent. The games themselves often encourage this by framing Poe Collection as completionist content, rather than as engagement with tragedy. The final theme is the ambiguity of the afterlife. Despite Poes being explicitly about death and what comes after, the games never clearly explain what actually happens to souls that pass on properly. We know Poes are trapped, but trapped from what? Where are the properly dead? What does successful death look like in the Zelda universe? This ambiguity makes the Poes' situation even more tragic, because we can't even be certain what they're missing. We know it's better than being a Poe, but is it oblivion, reincarnation, a spiritual realm? The uncertainty means the Poes are trapped in a bad state while striving for an unknown good state, unable to achieve something they might not even be able to imagine. These themes combine to create a consistent tragic narrative across 30 years of games. Poes represent death gone wrong, souls exploited, suffering ignored, and mercy rarely granted. They're a dark undercurrent in a series that often emphasizes heroism and hope, a reminder that not everyone gets a happy ending, and that some suffering persists long after death should have ended it. What makes this particularly effective storytelling is that it's mostly optional. Players can engage with these themes as deeply or as superficially as they choose. You can fight Poes as simple enemies and collect their souls as gameplay rewards, never thinking about the implications. Or you can stop, read the item descriptions, consider the patterns, and confront the darkness these spirits represent. The Legend of Zelda series is often seen as hopeful and heroic, and in many ways it is. Link saves the world, defeats evil, and restores peace. But the Poes remind us that not everything can be saved, that some damage persists, and that even in worlds where heroes triumph, there are those who suffer eternally at the margins. The tragedy of the Poes is that they're former people whose deaths went wrong, and then their suffering was systematically exploited by the living. Their spirits twisted by regret and negative emotion, bound to the world by unfinished business or curses, and then hunted, collected, sold, and used without acknowledgement of their personhood or their pain. Across dozens of games and multiple timelines, their situation remains fundamentally unchanged. Some are given names and stories and occasionally freed, but the vast majority remain anonymous, their identities lost, their fates ambiguous. They're treated as obstacles and resources, their souls reduced to items in an inventory or percentages on a completion screen. But understanding their tragedy means recognizing them as more than enemies or collectibles. It means seeing them as evidence of what happens when death fails, when the social and spiritual mechanisms that should guide souls to their proper end break down. They're symptoms of curses, betrayals, and systemic failures, victims of circumstances they likely didn't understand and couldn't control. The few moments of mercy, sharp and flat ascending together, the Poe Sisters finally at rest, the souls in the depths being guided by the bargainer statues. These exceptions prove that resolution is possible. They show that with the right intervention, the right ritual, or the right guide, Poes can move on, can find the peace that was denied to them in death. But these exceptions are rare enough to highlight how common the exploitation and suffering are. For every named Poe who finds peace, there are hundreds or thousands of anonymous spirits who simply cease to exist when defeated, their suffering ending in obliteration rather than resolution. This is what makes the Poe narrative so effective as dark undercurrent in the Zelda series. It doesn't dominate the story or overwhelm the more hopeful themes. It exists at the margins, in graveyards and shadows, in optional quests and completionist challenges. But it's always there. A reminder that death can go wrong, that suffering can extend beyond life, and that even in worlds of magic and heroes, some tragedies cannot be fixed. The Poes are the restless dead, the souls that fell through the cracks, the people no one remembers except as ghosts bearing lanterns in the dark. They're evidence that the Zelda universe, for all its wonder and adventure, has a cost that someone has to pay. And that cost is borne by those who can no longer speak, who can no longer advocate for themselves, who exist only as spirits trapped between the world that forgot them and the rest they'll never reach. So the next time you encounter a Poe in any Zelda game, take a moment before you defeat it. Consider who they might have been, what they might have lost, and how long they've been trapped in this half-existence. Consider that their soul will probably be bottled or collected, turned into a resource or a quest item, used for someone else's purpose rather than freed. Consider that they're victims, not villains, and that their monstrosity is the result of suffering, not evil. And consider how rare it is for anyone in these games to show them mercy, to treat them as people deserving of peace, rather than obstacles to be cleared or resources to be harvested. That's the tragedy of the Poes. Not just that they're trapped, but that almost no one cares that they are. Not just that they suffer, but that their suffering has been commodified and gamified and turned into content. Not just that they're lost, but that there's rarely anyone looking for them, trying to bring them home. Except perhaps you. The player who stops to think about what these spirits represent, who reads the item descriptions and connects the patterns, who recognizes that beneath the gameplay mechanics and boss fights, there's a story being told about death, regret, exploitation, and the rare, precious moments when mercy triumphs over suffering. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Zelda's darkest recurring elements, consider subscribing to the channel. There are so many more stories hiding in these games, tales of tragedy and triumph, of characters we overlook, and themes we take for granted. Each video is an exploration of the lore that makes these worlds feel real, lived in, and full of meaning beyond just the hero's journey. Hit that like button if this changed how you'll think about Poes the next time you encounter them, and drop a comment sharing your favorite Poe moment or theory from any Zelda game. I read every comment, and your insights often inspire future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next exploration of the lore that makes gaming worlds so endlessly fascinating.